Welcome back to the Clinical Athlete Podcast. If you're not familiar with Clinical Athlete, we're a network of healthcare providers, students, and coaches who specialize in the management of athletes. You can find your nearest clinical athlete provider at clinicalathlete.com. We also have the Clinical Athlete Forum, where we discuss and share ideas and resources related to athlete health and performance. So to join the forum or for a potential listing on the Clinical Athlete Directory and for all upcoming seminars, webinars, and events, details can be found on the website. We've got lots of weightlifting and powerlifting certifications coming up and some awesome webinars that we'll touch on here in a bit. So check out the website for that. This podcast can also be found on the website along with YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio. My name is Quinn Hannock, and I'm a doctor of physical therapy in Orange County, California at Clinical Athlete Newport. I'm joined by Jared Maynard, who is the Clinical Athlete Continuing Education Director and Coordinator and a physiotherapist in Ontario, Canada. He's also a strength coach and runs an online powerlifting coaching company and is a competitive powerlifter himself. What's up, Jared?
I'm good, man. How are you? You feeling awake?
Oh, yeah. Perky.
Ready to go?
Uh-huh. I'm ready.
Excellent.
You
look like it.
Oh, thanks, man. Are you being sarcastic? Is my hair, messed up or something?
No, you look pretty good. I am being sarcastic, but you look all right.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And we're also super excited to welcome onto the show another Jared with 2 R's, the more expensive version, Jared Boyd, who is a physical therapist, strength and conditioning coach, and track coach, who currently is in Maryland and just finished up at Rehab to Perform out there with Josh Funk. He was there for a few years, but just accepted a new position in Virginia with military special ops. So that's pretty cool. So 1, Jared, thank you for being on the show, and 2, congrats on the amazing new opportunity.
Thank you for you guys for allowing me to be on here. I'm super excited to kind of talk to you guys today, and just want to say I love the stuff you guys have been putting out with just trying to shift the narrative in regard to physical therapy, rehab, all things kind of sports and athletics. So I think you guys are doing some great work. But yeah, man, just finished up Rehab to Perform, as you mentioned, with Josh Funk. And that was a great chapter of my professional career. Really allowed me to develop clinically, personally, and kind of just harness a little bit some of my my thought process and critical thinking skills. But this kind of presented itself with this next opportunity. Kind of presented itself with the ability to have a little bit more autonomy in regard to physical therapy, with a lot of privileges in the military setting, and being able to kind of say, hey, how do I really blend even more the physical rehabilitation and physical preparation with the tactical population. So I'm super excited to be able to kind of start this next endeavor.
That's awesome, man. You're going to have just a laboratory on the day-to-day to test, retest.
Oh, yeah. And some crazy stories, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. Well, and you're going to be doing a webinar for us on September 8th, and that's titled Reconditioning the Injured Athlete, Principles Over Methods. And we wanted to get you on the show to dig into that stuff a little bit here, because there's a lot there. But before we do that, can you tell our 6 listeners a little bit more about yourself and what's led you to where you are today as a clinician and a coach?
Yeah, so a little bit about me. I attended Virginia Commonwealth University for undergrad and a bachelor's in exercise science. And, from there, I knew that I wanted to either go the physical therapy or doctor of osteopathic medicine route. I really wasn't quite sure yet until I started to have a little bit more clinical or shadowing experiences. And I figured, I think PT is the route I wanted to go. Seems like it had a little bit more of the ability to build rapport with patients and have more of that one-on-one time. So I went that route, and from there went to Shenandoah University, which was really, really great opportunity because I was able to have a degree that was biased in rehab with physical therapy, but also a degree with an athletic training background, more of the acute emergency medicine side of things. So being able to merge those 2 entities together really allowed me to see from start to finish what does that process look like from an athletic standpoint. And so in school, I was afforded the opportunity to have some great clinical rotations as well, which I think continue to cultivate my mindset in regard to the sport or performance realm. So those included the University of Tennessee, the United States Air Force Academy, and Exos. And so while they were all kind of different, they had a lot of similarities. And the end goal is to get that specific population, more so sports or tactical at the Air Force Academy, back to a specific goal, which is to perform with trying to minimize or mitigate injury, but then also trying to maximize potential for performance. So I really was able to learn a lot in those particular settings. And from there, I actually, my first job was actually at this clinic that was not very sports specific. It was more manual therapy biased, more of like the structural biomechanical lens. And so from there, that further led me to say, hey, I got to get out of here. I'm not able to use my skill set. And I just don't see eye to eye with the owner. And so that's when I found Rehab to Perform, worked there for about 3 years, and then again was presented with the tactical athlete physical therapy position.
Yeah, sometimes even in a position where you're not necessarily the happiest, that can be a good learning experience as well, because you can at least learn what you don't want.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just so many narratives that I heard from. It was a DO that owned the place, a doctor of osteopathic, and
that was going to be you.
Yeah, it was, exactly. And, just the narratives and the beliefs and some of the fear that he kind of instilled with the patients, it kind of just didn't sit well with me. And so that's what really made me kind of take a step back and say, hey, what do I want to do? What do I want to make sure that I don't emulate? And that's kind of what actually, then led to me starting to figure out some of these principles that I wanted to abide by in clinical practice.
Yeah. Well, and of course, it's not based on the title of the professional. It's on the individual. So you can be a DO and still have principles that are rooted in science. So if a DO Absolutely. Is one of our 6 listeners, don't take that personally. And were you, just out of curiosity, were you at VCU when Shaka Smart was there and the basketball team was doing its thing?
Oh man, it was amazing. I was there. It's funny. I was actually an RA as well.
Oh, cool.
I was an RA, yeah, for the basketball team. So that was quite an experience. It was wild when we went to the Final Four.
I bet. So your webinar title again is Reconditioning the Injured Athlete, but Principles Over Methods. And I wanted us to jump off the conversation with more of a general philosophical discussion on that concept. So can you give a synopsis on this principles over methods concept, what that means to you and why you think it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. I think nowadays in this era, especially with social media, there is an abundance of information that is readily available. And it's a lot of it is, I think, kind of saturated with things that have a decreased intent or a lot of complexity. And so, when we look at lack of intent, high complexity, it kind of detracts from our ability to make appropriate decisions and not really have a strong backbone, so to speak. And so, principles for me mean, well, what are the scientific or foundational or fundamental premises that we're abiding by that help us to kind of navigate through the noise, or what I like to say to curate the complexity, so to speak. And so, with that, we're able to make a little bit more of the ability to manipulate certain variables a little bit more strategically and understand to a better degree what outcomes we are trying to accomplish and what we have accomplished. Obviously, there's going to be a degree of uncertainty with any presentation. We can't know with 100% authority, but I think with having some type of principle or blueprint in place, it allows you to become a little bit more repeatable in your process, or go back to the drawing board and say, hey, what did I do throughout this process that wasn't the most beneficial or suitable for that particular athlete or that particular patient. A good friend of mine and a coworker who's brilliant he said, if you're trying to make a house, create a house, and you don't have a blueprint or you don't have principles, and you happen to somehow create the house, well, what's the chances that you're able to do it again? They're probably very, very low because you didn't have the principles or the blueprint. And the chances of succeeding the first time are also going to be pretty slim as well. But having those principles in place can help you make sure that you're streamlining things a little bit more and keeps you accountable as a practitioner.
Would you say also it's kind of a why versus how conversation? Like if we're going to use a different analogy, like a recipe, where you can memorize the recipe, but you don't have any flexibility if you want to experiment with a different ingredient or a different dose of a certain ingredient or something like that. You've only got that one way. And when that one way doesn't work, or you need to incorporate some flexibility within your method, you don't have that. But if you understand the principles of how the ingredients interact with each other, why your cooking time for some ingredients is longer or shorter than another, stuff like that. So you've got the principles, and now you can build in flexibility within your method. Is that somewhat of an accurate analogy?
Yes, definitely. It's. I like that analogy a lot, and it's almost as if you don't have those principles, you become very myopic, so to speak, and you become very rigid in your attachments to certain methods, and so then you limit your adaptability to variable situations. Let's say someone's a purist with, and again, all these methods I think can have a place in treatment, depending on the situation and the scenario. But someone might be a purist, FRC, and that's all they do, or SFMA, that's all they do, PRI, DNS, whatever method you want to use. But they can't stray away from that. Again, they become myopic. And so I think if you're able to understand, well, what are my principles? I can choose any particular method I like because it fits the scenario. And I can be a little bit more fluid or have some maneuverability throughout the process. It's almost as if you got a lot of tools or a lot of methods, but your organization is limited. So your toolbox itself isn't organized for all the tools that you have. So you never really know which one to pick and choose or plug and play with the individual or a specific presentation that you're presented with.
Yeah, you hear it's just another tool in my toolbox analogy used quite a bit, and it's like, well, if it's the wrong tool, or if it doesn't matter how many tools you got, or if you don't know how to use them.
I was going to say just that. Yeah, you could have like the fanciest toolbox ever, but if you're just a crap handy person, like it doesn't do you any good, really.
Yeah, exactly.
And you mentioned the blueprint analogy as well. Well, a blueprint is like a plan. It doesn't necessarily tell you how to build the structure, like the real nitty gritty, but that's maybe if you understand the principles of constructing the plan, then you've got something going there, and again you can be flexible. So I like to use these. I like talking through these analogies because I think it helps provide a framework. And with that, when we talk about reconditioning the injured athlete, or i.e. rehab, versus performance training, is it a versus performance training, or how do you see those two worlds blending together? Do you see them as as the same? Are there differences where you're dichotomizing rehab and performance to some extent? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think they are very much one and the same, with a few considerations. I mean, the biggest thing I think in regard to, rehab or reconditioning as opposed to specifically training is that I look at them almost as a continuum. And so there's going to be a little bit tighter parameters with the reconditioning or rehabbing specific individual. And that's going to be likely due to a higher or lower, tolerance. So they have higher sensitivity or irritability. And so we need a little bit more guardrails set in place to make sure that we don't overly exceed their tolerance or their capacity, because it's already lowered from the potential injury or tissue insult. And so, for them, how do we make sure that we're allocating the stress appropriately and we're being a little bit more strategic? But again, that's a similar principle that you would have for someone that's just training without an injury. We're going to still be relatively specific and strategic about how we manipulate certain variables so that we don't increase or overtax them in regard to their envelope of function. We don't want to have this structural failure, and so I think the biggest thing is going to be manipulating those variables, but then also the mindset. That's going to be a huge thing. I think with your training, your mindset is a little different compared to when you're rehabbing. You're going to be a little bit more apprehensive, potentially. And so we want to make sure that one of the principles is to cultivate this mindset or this optimism. And so I think we really need to harness that when we're dealing with an athlete that's injured as well, and really create this environment to where they feel less threatened. And if I feel or perceive less threat, that I'm likely to move a little bit more, have those movement options available for me to then be able to tolerate the appropriate amount of stress needed to try to induce a specific adaptation. And so, I try not to dichotomize them too much, but there is going to be this gradual escalating demand of stressors from the injured athlete, and then moving across the spectrum towards, okay, now we're training and we're really getting after it, and we're more so worried about output as opposed to worried about the input of the localized tissue with the injured athlete.
I've seen it written, and I generally subscribe to rehab is just training within the inconvenience of pain or injury. We could probably more realistically say within the complexity of pain and injury, and that brings on a whole host of other factors, a lot of which you mentioned. You also mentioned the concept of envelope of function, and I want to go into that a little bit more because I think it's a really, really useful framework for clinicians if they haven't heard of that. Can you talk a little bit about the envelope of function and what that means to you as a clinician, and if that's an education point that you use in the rehab process with your athletes?
Oh yeah, huge education piece. I think education is going to be very valuable for any athlete. A lot of times, it's funny, we think, education is only going to be for patients that are having persistent pain, because we want to make sure we don't instill maladaptive thoughts and beliefs. But the same thing can happen for the injured athlete that has something acute or subacute or that's younger as well. So, using those educational resources and tools such as envelope of function can be valuable. To me, what it means is we all have this relatively set point or homeostasis, with a little bit of allostasis as well, meaning certain variables that kind of change and move that allow us to maintain homeostatic set points. And so if we have some disruption with that, whether it's an injury or whether it's just pain, we're going to likely then start to lower our homeostasis or being able to perform the things that we once were able to do without having any type of limitations or hesitation. And so, what we start to see is that as the rehab process goes on, what we're trying to do is shift the curve back to the right, to where we're starting to increase how much that person can tolerate, can sustain, can output without having any associated negative consequences. It's almost as if the same thing could be with graded exposure. They're similar in a sense that, again, it's all about the specific adaptations to the imposed demands, but we just have to be very strategic about those demands that we're imposing on the system, because we know there's a lower tolerance level to them. So we don't want to overwhelm or overtax the system too fast, too soon. That's kind of how I view the envelope of function, kind of slow and steady, and having a little bit of some parameters set forth.
Yeah, education piece to the athletes, just anchoring to a context that they can understand is important. And the envelope of function I really like, because it's easy to understand, and it can be, you can use a bucket if you want, or whatever implement that holds a degree of capacity. But envelope of function, coined by a guy named Scott Dye back in the 90s, which was originally with patellofemoral pain, but like you said, it can be applied pretty much across the board. And it's just like, what is your tolerance and capacity at this moment, and we can improve that over time. But I think it gives a framework to where you are now and where we want to be. And instead of comparing yourself to who you were as the athlete, because a lot of athletes will do that. It's, well, I don't know why I got hurt this time. I do that. I did that workout 100 times, or I've done this. And to your point, there's a whole lot of other factors that go into your envelope of function than just the training. So I really, really like that. And you talked about tolerance for a little bit, but I've heard you talk about the heuristics that you use through the rehab process. And can you dig into, first of all, what is a heuristic?
Yeah.
And secondly, what are these heuristics that you use through the rehab process, and just the kind of different phases of that?
Yeah. So, heuristics are basically, they're shortcuts or pathways, so to speak, to allow us to come up with a better decision or understanding of something that we're presented with quicker. And it's not always the best, I will say, because we can potentially miss certain variables. But I think it allows you to bucket it. And to a certain degree, yes, you're generalizing, but it allows you to bucket certain presentations. And then from there, you can kind of funnel or filter a little bit more to really become more strategic about what it is you're trying to accomplish, or what the need is of that athlete at that time in that particular moment. So that's what a heuristic is. It's almost as it's just a bucketing of different categories and presentations. And so the 4 heuristics of need that I've kind of allowed myself to become a little bit more, I guess, biased with, because we all have biases, are going to be tolerance, capacity, competency, and variability. And so the definition that I've made for those are tolerance is going to be the ability of the tissue to absorb, transfer, or produce force, but making sure it's not exceeding its physiological limits that are potentially creating sensitivity and irritability. And so that's a little bit of the envelope of function that we just talked about, or that graded exposure. We've kind of exceeded that, and so now we can't tolerate said activity or movement. And this is really similar to capacity, but the way that I differentiate it with capacity is because we have moderate to high symptoms prior to reaching or even exceeding our capacity. We haven't even had an output yet. All we have is these symptoms that preclude us from being able to have any type of adaptation occur by reaching capacity. Capacity, I would term as the ability to produce and sustain energy or some degree of output at an efficient rate and length, dependent on the environmental demands or the task. So, someone might present with things such as, tendinopathy. Someone might present with Achilles discomfort, and it happens at the same time or the same mile with every run. And so to me, that depicts more of a limitation in their capacity. It's going to be something where there's low sustainability or depletion prior to completion is what I kind of call it. And so, the onset happens here all the time. Yes, it could be a tolerance thing as well, but to me, it's more of a capacity. They can't sustain output to meet the demands of their required or desired activities. And then we look at the next heuristic. So we have tolerance, we have capacity, and then I have variability. which is, I look at it through the lens of the ability to acquire and adapt to variable positions or have options or gears to choose from, again, depending on the environment, the situation, the task that's at hand. Someone, let's say a bodybuilder, might not need as much variability as perhaps a gymnast. So variability is also going to be dictated by certain constraints that I need in order to allow me to be successful at whatever endeavor I choose. I think a lot of people throw the term, variability around as this. Oh, variability is just this great and it's innate and everyone needs it. I think we all need it, but again, it's at a certain degree that we need it in order to be successful at what it is we're trying to accomplish. And so, with variability, certain subjective or objective findings or information that I'm hearing or looking for would be just habitual tendencies that someone might have environmentally, potentially, or even habitual tendencies from a standpoint of, hey, they just have this redundancy in activity, and we need to kind of reduce the monotony and allow them to explore different planes and different patterns, or a little bit of novelty, but still that novelty is going to be prefaced with some specific intent, as opposed to novelty just for the sake of novelty, and it's complex, but it doesn't have any specific, it doesn't warrant any specific adaptation. And then lastly, we look at competency. So this is, where it gets a little complicated, I guess, or it could get complicated, and people could argue, well, what does competency mean? To me, it means proficient movement with optimal outcomes. So then you say, well, we can get even, I guess, a little bit more specific and say, well, what is optimal? To me, optimal is what's the best solution to a movement problem for that particular individual. And so we're, sometimes optimal might require constraints that is more suitable for the solution that person needs. So, competency gets a little bit more challenging. But for example, that might be someone who has never done a powerlifting move, and they're just not competent at it. And they need a little bit more of a, hey, let's try to go back or regress a little bit and start to build you back up, to give you the layers or the constraints you need in order to be a little bit more proficient or optimize your movement with this particular exercise. And so, those are the four heuristics that I think allow me to bucket individuals. And then from there, obviously, you can filter even more and determine what it is that they need from those buckets.
With competency, I really like that you included the word constraints, because it sounds like we're including within that idea, or rather, we're not saying that there needs to be one particular way for someone to do a thing, and there's not perhaps a singular solution for a movement problem, because if we're talking about athletes, almost irrespective of what the sport or the activity is, there are going to be a myriad of situations that they might find themselves in. And we've talked about dynamic systems and motor skill acquisition a few times in the last few months, but with the highly skilled athletes, they've got lots of movement variability, more so than, say, your intermediate athletes, just because they've got more solutions available to them. And you can train that, to a large extent, just by manipulating the constraints of the tasks that they're subjected to, which then probably goes a long way in terms of equipping them to feel confident, and then also to perform, as well as they can in most situations they might find themselves in.
Yeah, they have the ability to accommodate to an ever-changing, ever-shifting environment and regulate potential disturbances or perturbations, and still come up with a optimal or ideal solution. And it might not be something that is entirely efficient, So, I look at efficient as just the cost of doing business. It might not be entirely efficient, but it's still for them optimal in regard to, hey, I maximize my potential as best I could, while knowing that, hey, there was a little bit of a disturbance or something happened that I would have rather not, but I had the right amount of adaptability and variability to do so.
I see competency and variability as very intertwined and related. As you mentioned, competency can almost be distilled down to just consistent outcomes, but consistent outcomes, again, you can get the outcome a myriad of ways. And there's a phrase by one of the forefathers of motor skill acquisition, Nikolai Bernstein, who would always say repetition without repetition. So a skilled blacksmith is consistent in the outcome, but no repetition looks exactly the same. And you can think about skilled athletes where they can achieve the outcome in a myriad of different ways. And if we talk about this clinically, typically athletes are coming to us and their variability is decreased, and their outcomes are variable as well, typically. But sometimes, and then they can progress perhaps through the initial stages of rehab, where now we can, like you said, Jared, we can constrain the task to a point where we can get consistent outcomes, but not in variable scenarios. Their variability is still low. Their competency is maybe getting a little bit better within the constraints, be it a range of motion constraint or a speed constraint. Maybe we've had to slow the movement down, use less load, or like more top-down instruction, where it's more of a structured activity as opposed to their perception, kind of driving the action, that type of thing. But then we can start to take away those constraints a little bit, which I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you've talked about phases of rehab starting with control and progressing to chaos. And I want to talk a little bit about that, but it sounds like we're kind of getting into that. So I like when you were kind of tying in competency there with variability. And I also want to talk about tolerance versus capacity, because when we have these philosophical discussions, for some people it can be hard to, like, how is this clinically relevant? But you gave an example that I think is totally relevant. I think tolerance versus capacity is relevant in most clinical situations. So it was the runner who can't tolerate running at all. So as soon as they start to do anything more than a walk, let's say patellar tendinopathy or Achilles tendinopathy or something like that, whatever it is, as soon as they transition into that task, they feel their irritability or their sensitivity or whatever they're coming to you for starts to appear, versus a capacity issue where they can do their thing and their lack of tolerance doesn't show until a certain point in their capacity, but they can actually push the threshold of their capacity before they become intolerant. So there's an interplay there. So you have these two athletes, and they have different thresholds, essentially. Can you, I know this is kind of like hypotheticals, but can you maybe talk a little bit about how the initial rehab process would be different for those two athletes in terms of maybe how you would allow them to program or allow them to go through their activity just on the day-to-day, and also what you would be doing in the clinic for somebody who's got a very low tolerance, not even touching their capacity, versus someone who their tolerance is higher and they can push into their capacity a little bit more? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes complete sense. Absolutely. I love that question. So for tolerance, for me, it would be more of, again, it's along the lines of, okay, they've exceeded their envelope of function, so to speak. It's very, very low. And so I want to use some level of load for induction of graded exposure. If we're speaking of specifically a tendon, we know that load is the language of tendons. And so if we can manipulate load enough to where we can start to induce stress, and the stress that they can tolerate, for me, I'm using higher frequency because I want them to get more dosage throughout the day of that particular stimulus in order to hopefully try to create an adaptation, and it might not be at that point for the low tolerance individual. It might not be at a point where we're creating true adaptation to the tissue, but what we might be doing is creating an adaptation to the brain in regard to taking off the threat perception, so to speak, and becoming less apprehensive to that stimulus. So for that individual, it might be let's find a movement and a load that you can tolerate. A lot of times what I've seen, and some of the research points to this, although it is kind of changing a little bit now, is that isometrics can be relatively beneficial for someone that has low tolerance level. Let's just perform again, it depends on, is it mid-insertional, is it insertional, or mid-portion versus insertional, but let's choose a height that you can tolerate. Let's choose a length of time that you can tolerate that load. And then I want you to do that maybe twice. Preferably I'd like to get it 3 times, because again, I'm more of a frequency as opposed to just one dosage a day. And I want to see how they do with that and what the 24-hour period looks like for them. So when they come back in, do we need to titrate anything a little bit? Because I always use the analogy for them that movement and load is medicine. We just have to make sure that we get the dosage correctly. We might go over, and that's okay. We know what to do and to kind of recalibrate things if we go over. If it's under, then we can push it up just a little bit, but we want to find that sweet spot that you're able to tolerate, that your body can regulate well. If we're looking at capacity, then for that individual, I'm looking at probably manipulating just a little bit their current workout. And what I want to do is say, hey, let's reduce your workload just a little bit. And we're going to reduce things, but I'm going to increase your maybe your biomotor quality. So, for that individual, I might just look at overall either muscular strength or endurance. I would do a heel rise test, which is looking at 30 beats per minute of a heel raise. And they're going to do that for around 25 to 30 reps. There are some specific norms, but I kind of got that one from Chris Johnson. And that allows me to see, what is the capacity on the involved versus the uninvolved limb, and from there, how do I become a little bit more specific about the dosage that I'm giving them in regard to the load as well as the repetitions in the set, so the overall volume. And then for that individual, I want to bridge the gap from where they are now to getting back into surpassing their running mileage by hopefully getting elastic as soon as I can. I'm thinking of, if it's tendon related, they have a lack of sustainable elasticity. And if I can start to do a little bit more rapid elastic motions sooner, some research has been shown that actually can induce a little bit more of the collagen synthesis. So again, we don't have to have that in order to decrease discomfort and increase capacity, but I think having the ability to sustain repeatable elasticity improves capacity of a tendon. And so that might be doing prescribed pogo exercises or jump roping exercises as well, as opposed to only doing heavy isometrics or isotonic work to the tendon. I want to make things that have a little bit better carryover to their task.
And yeah, so pogoing or jump ropes, or even just pretending you're jump roping, but just that's basically a pogo. Mm-hmm. That, to me, when you said before, you vary the task. Novelty is powerful, but it's not variability for the sake of variability. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think we get into in the rehab world a lot, where you see exercises that look difficult just because there's like 4 things involved, and you're like juggling, and you're on the Bosu ball, and you've got maybe you're wearing glasses that obstruct your vision, and there's like a whole,
and you're on fire.
You're on fire. Yeah, exactly. But let's say pogoing, very simple exercise, but you've you've constrained the task to be able to control the dose. Because somebody could say, well, can't I just run? Well, yes, but you've already mentioned, Jared, that you're controlling their workload and as far as that's concerned as well. But running is less constrained. It's less controllable. Like you're not there controlling their cadence and really controlling their mileage and controlling the terrain. All of these little things that factor into the actual stress of that dosage, of that bout. But something like pogoing or just jump ropes, you can be very, very controlled with the dosage, and you can pick an arbitrary dose and then just base your next decision on how they tolerated that dosage. But to me, would that be an example? It's a varied task, but it's specific to the qualities that you're trying to develop for their goal activity.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's allowing them to adapt to that particular stimulus, and it's varied enough as well to where it's not specific. It's not specifically the task, but it has enough, and it emulates enough of the qualities that will bridge the gap and be able to transition them back to their task without there being this huge spike in their load tolerance or a huge spike in just the quote unquote novelty of the activity, because it's like, oh man, I haven't done this in a long time. Well, no, you actually have. We've just changed it a little bit. But the pogo has great carryover because we're looking at the elasticity, the ground contact times, things of that nature that mimic the similar situations that you're going to be in when you're running. And I like double leg pogos as well, because I'm thinking of, 2 points of contact as opposed to 1 point of contact with running. So, we have to account for more force being induced onto the tendon as opposed to double leg, where force is going to be going across both limbs upon contact with the ground.
Go ahead, Jared. Sorry. No, you go.
I was going to say, to riff off of the idea of variability, but not just for variability's sake, and how, especially when it comes to social media and the idea of rehab that a lot of people are exposed to, where we've got these seemingly fancy and impressive exercises that may not always have, either a very clear or a very applicable rationale. That seems like in order for us to have the outcomes or reasonable effectiveness with our clients using things that are variable but maybe not super fancy or super sexy, we probably need to set that expectation from the start. Which, Jared, you mentioned that with your point about titrating exercise and communicating that to our clients, saying like, we might overdo the dosage. Here's how we're going to manage this. We got a lot of things that we can adjust, but also I think that if we communicate to our clients that we don't have to get overly fancy, and by the same token, as clinicians and clients, we'll be putting our heads together to figure out, are there any sort of bases that we're not covering? Are there any skills or task demands that we haven't exposed you to yet? If we can make sure that we're doing all of that's what we need to do. We don't need to necessarily go above and beyond just because the return on investment in terms of time and effort may not be there. But I think it's part of the challenge that we're dealing with as clinicians, because many people are coming in to see us with that expectation, either explicitly or implicitly, sort of in the back of their minds, just because they've seen it on the gram.
Yeah, I love everything you just said. It really resonates with me, and a lot of it is, I think people really gravitate towards complexity, both on the clinician practitioner end, but then also on the consumer end as well. I think from a clinician perspective, it's more of like a pride, or this, we're trying to kind of harness our, to a certain degree, egocentric state. And so we feel like, okay, well, if I'm more complex, it means that I'm likely smarter. I'm like the savior, so to speak. And then, with that, though, it kind of detracts, as you said, from our ability to have this very specific stimulus or stress that we're placing on a tissue and understanding the outcome. And so we have less intent if we have a lot of complexity, and it's kind of superfluous with no specific meaning or no purposeful meaning to it. So yeah, I think it's all about expectations and having that conversation with the patient and saying, hey, this is the plan of care that we're going to go with. We understand our principles, and I tell this to my athletes all the time. We understand our principles. If you get a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of sensitivity, then I don't want you to be alarmed. I'm not alarmed by it. We're just going to adjust the dosage appropriately, as you said, Quinn, and then we'll continue to progress down the continuum in regard to manipulating other variables such as velocity or such as making things unpredictable, or making things, again, looking at like that control to chaos continuum, whatever it is that they need.
Totally. Yeah, I'd argue that it takes a more skilled clinician to sell people on the simplistic but effective approach, as opposed to the clinician who's using a whole bunch of newfangled things that are flashy and shiny that people just might perceive more value from, but it may not actually be there in practice. Yeah,
they're devoid of any particular outcomes that I just don't think are. Or maybe not outcomes is the best word, but they're devoid of the very strategic influences to the tissue or to the organism that are going to be conducive for durability, longevity, adaptability, whatever you want to call it.
When you've both talked about, if we go back to the example of pogo exercise, and you've posted about this exercise, you've got videos on your Instagram about this thing, so that can be modified and varied. So it's a simple exercise, but there's a myriad of different ways to vary that stimulus. You can change the vectors, like you already mentioned, going single leg, double leg. You can put a sprint at the end, or like some type of crossover sprint, or whatever you want. So starting simplistic and constraining the task, and then layering on complexity within that is still something that we can do. So it doesn't all have to be snoozing exercises and just like super boring, mundane things, but it's like what we've mentioned. If you're setting the groundwork education-wise right up front, then at least the expectations are met that we got to put the work in. It's kind of that blue-collar mentality. Going into some of these phases, I really wanted to talk to you about this, is the phases of rehab as a contextual framework to help you dampen some of the noise and focus on the relevant variables for the individual athlete, for their particular goal, activities. Can you talk a little bit about what these phases are, or how you conceptualize them over the course of a rehab process? And then within that, can you talk about how key performance indicators, or KPIs, guide your progression as you go through these different phases?
Yeah, absolutely. So phases of rehab, and like you said, I try to make sure that I'm thinking, but also relay this to the athlete, that they understand this isn't a black and white. There's going to be some gray area in there, and there's going to be a little bit of a degree of uncertainty, just because of the fact that the human organism is going to, at every day, any moment, any time, is going to be variable. And that's the norm. Variability is the norm. And so these are just, again, a little bit more of a guardrail, and they allow us to make sure we're checking off boxes appropriately before we start to manipulate any of the intensity, the velocity, frequency of movement or exercises. So the first phase is what we would call homeostasis restoration. Basically, that means, how do we restore, quote unquote, normalcy to the system? How do we allow people to regulate stress a little bit better? Well, if I'm already in this state of high sympathetic because of a potential injury or pain, I'm likely going to have less movement options, which again is one of the principles that we discussed earlier. So what I want to do is say, how do I get them back to this parasympathetic state so that when I start to stress them, I can actually go up. I think Michelle Boland kind of uses the analogy of like an elevator. If I have 1 through 10, if I'm already at 9, then I can do one or two things. I can only go to 10, and it's not going to be a lot of room, or I can go through the roof, and that's going to have negative consequences as well. So homeostasis restoration is trying to say, how do I make sure that I get someone all the way back down to the bottom floor, so now I can escalate up 9 more levels and be able to tolerate and accept stress. So clinically, that looks like restoring range of motion, being able to ambulate and have locomotive capabilities without any considerable deviations, being able to have, for lack of better words, activation to the specific tissue. I'm thinking if we're thinking of a ACL reconstruction, then I want to have observable quadriceps contraction that's volitional. So that's the homeostasis restoration. And then, from there, we look at athletic foundation. Athletic foundation is going to be where we're trying to restore and provide people back the options for movement patterns such as push, pull, hinge, squat, rotate, and a little bit more of the locomotive patterns such as marching. We might start to get into some skipping as well, because we're looking at this from an athletic standpoint. We know that eventually we want to get to sprinting. So we're already starting to bridge the gap with some technical proficiency. When we're looking at the hierarchy of sprinting considerations, we can start to implement that early on. So those are going to be really where we're just getting body weight, capacity, and competency through more of your metabolic conditioning circuits, where you could do, sled push, goblet squat, and some kind of upper extremity pulling exercise as well. Just general conditioning for the entire body globally, but still making sure we're not losing sight of the localized tissue that they're in the clinic for. And then after the athletic foundation, we kind of transition over into the biomotor integration. This is kind of where we're really, really getting after it. So we're thinking more of the output. We're thinking of how do we start to use a little bit more of, I would say, conjugate training, where we have complementary qualities that we're going to be focusing on. So we might focus a little bit more on truly building strength, but we can also implement some power with that as well, because we know with the upcoming phase that we need to make sure that person can not only exude power, but also tolerate the power output that they're going to be displaying. Because if I have a lot of power that I'm dispersing, can I also tolerate the input, thinking of absorption versus production? So biomotor integration is going to be a lot of the strength, power, speed. We're going to get into some sprinting. With sprinting, there's certain considerations that I think about in regard to what are the prerequisites to be able to get into sprinting. I'm looking at localized tissue capacity of gastrocsoleus complex, because it's going to be a huge muscle to allow you to have force production or be able to propel forward, but also it's going to help out with dampening forces with ground contact time, especially the soleus. I'm looking at their overall unilateral competency. I'm looking at their ability to have gone through the continuum of plyometrics. So can they go from a jump to a bound to a hop to a pogo, to a single leg pogo? And then have they gone through some of the locomotive the locomotive escalating demands of stressors? So we're looking at, can they go from marching to skipping to a little bit more of the sprint specific skips that are still, yes, looking at the technical proficiency from a posture, locomotive standpoint, but also we're still stressing the tissues, but just in a reduced velocity or a tissue excursion standpoint. And so that's the biomotor integration. And then lastly, we look at going through the phase of performance actualization. So that is where we have this cognitive perceptual ability to be able to handle fluctuations in making decisions on the fly. So it's it's less anticipatory, more reactive. It's more unpredictable. It's more change of direction oriented. It's going to be something that really emulates the task that they're going to be exposed to when they return to their specific or chosen sport. So for them, what variables can we manipulate that really make sure that the biomotor part replicates what they're going to be immersed in, but also the bioenergetic part. So it might be a little bit more speed strength. It might be a little bit more alactic or lactic for a lot of sports, especially field sport. Or, for me, a lot of the track athletes that I work with as well are going to be a little bit more of like the alactic and lactic. Obviously, it can be higher, it can be a little bit lower as well if they are more of the middle distance runner or someone that has like this sport that doesn't require a lot of speed. And but I would argue that most sports will need that. And so those are the phases: homeostasis, restoration, athletic foundation, biomotor integration, and performance actualization. And when you look at it, even with that health performance continuum, they really are kind of in line with that. We start with health. Let's just make sure we get the aerobic capacity, we restore competency, we increase their confidence, they have variability, and they have just general physical preparation. They're doing things that are sustainable. And then we kind of slowly shift the spectrum to now it's performance. So we're looking more at some things such as it might be a little bit more rigidity there because, again, it's very specific to what it is that they're going to be performing. Not rigidity in regard to the expression or the execution of the task, but more so rigid in the approach that we're doing in order to in order to be able to emulate the task. And we're looking at things that might be a little bit more unsustainable because we know sprinting isn't unsustainable, but we've laid down the foundation with the prior phases or really focusing on health.
What are you using to progress from phase to phase? Is that where your key performance indicators come in? Are those things that you're assessing and appraising session to session? And are there times where somebody has seemingly progressed to another spot on the continuum, but have now regressed based on many, many factors? But how are you appraising that?
Yeah, that's a great point. The big thing is it's not really. I'll say session to session. Yes, we are assessing and appraising how they're performing. And that's going to be with any. I tell my students this too. Every follow-up, every session is going to be almost like to a certain degree a re-eval where we're reassessing the individual. So every exercise is to a degree a test to see how they're performing. So a lot of people think we have to have this formal testing in order to determine whether or not someone can proceed to the next stage or have their stresses manipulated. Formal testing is great. We need that because it holds us accountable as clinicians, but we can also look at the exercise that they're performing as well. But I would say, I do like to use specific parameters and key performance indicators for whatever sport it is. So I'm thinking of like a needs analysis. First is going to be what is the sport, what is the prior history of injury, and what is it that they already have, and what is it that they need at that time in order to bridge the gap from where they are to where they're going to be or where they want to be. And so if we're thinking of athletic foundation, I want to make sure prior to homeostasis restoration, prior to moving to athletic foundation, do they have the ability to ambulate? Can they navigate and negotiate going up and down steps? Do they need any type of assistive device such as crutches? If they still need those and have those parameters set, then they're not ready to rigorously be immersed in the athletic foundation phase because we still have some accommodation of movement that might not be as beneficial when we get into that phase of really loading the tissue globally. And so then when I look at athletic foundation, that might be something to where at the end of that phase, we're looking at things such as maybe a Y balance test, just looking at triplanar competency and orientation and confidence on one limb. We might look at things such as just overall, hey, can you perform, and again, it depends for the sport, but if I'm looking at a split squat or a goblet squat, a certain percentage of their body weight, because we know in the biomotor integration phase, we're going to start to implement some plyometrics. And I want to make sure they can handle a certain amount of external load appropriately prior to having that much force at that velocity go through the tissue with plyometrics. If we go through the performance or the performance actualization phase, which is the last phase, that's going to be more of like your 5-10-5 is what you're looking at for those individuals. But hopefully, prior to that, you've done some other testing that on their last day or their day of discharge or their day of getting back into competition or at least practice, you've already checked off a lot of boxes. We've done some hop testing as well. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, well, hop testing or limb symmetry index isn't necessarily that great. That's very true, and that's fair. But if we just throw our hands up and say, well, nothing matters, and all the research shows that the testing doesn't really give us all the answers, then, well, are you just going to train and just not do anything at all and not be accountable? I think we can have we need something that the profession kind of agrees on, or something to say, hey, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to stick to it. I'm going to see what the presentation looks like. And then from there, I can better triage the situation and come up with the appropriate intervention based off of the information that I just got from, again, maybe a hop test or a Y balance test, or from some of the strength testing that we would look at as well, or single leg triplanar competencies. Those are the things that I'm looking at for key performance indicators or the needs analysis within each particular phase.
The key seems to be having measures and qualifying those with what you're seeing subjectively with the athlete, and also probably what they're, giving you subjectively, with the feedback that they're providing you. So all of those things taken into account to make the determination of moving left or right on the continuum. My criticisms with our models and different rehab phases in general, which I subscribe to phases because they're reductionist models by definition.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're reducing we're trying to make it look good on paper first. This has got to make sense to me conceptually, because that's what a phase is. When you look at it on paper, it makes complete sense. Then the issue clinically is the variability of their presentation on the day-to-day. And, I thought we progressed to this phase, but now they've regressed a little bit. And so we're not actually at that phase. And if you look at it in a very deterministic way, like once you reach a new phase, the old phase is in the past and it no longer applies, or we're only determining when to progress to the next phase based on time. After 4 to 6 weeks, you're going to be at this phase, or after 4 months, you're now at this phase. That's where I think we run into problems with these things. And I really was interested to hear what you had to say there, and I think that the take-home points are really, really important. That these are it's a conceptual framework, but it's a continuum, and it's fluid. Because you mentioned allostasis earlier, and allostasis is, if we can distill the definition down there, is stability in the presence of change. So these things are really variable. And I like the take home points of theirs. You've got your key performance indicators progress in complexity themselves as you go up. So it's like you went from one, can you walk, to two, down the line, you've got these more complex integrated tests. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. And the person accumulates fitness, and they're going to be passing the older tests more consistently. But I guess my big point here is for the listeners is it's not going to be black and white. There's going to be some steps forward and a little bit of steps back, and maybe a lot of steps back and then a little step forward. But when you look at overall trends, they're going to be going in the right direction. It's just not linear.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
the trajectory is going to be overall, upward, but there's going to be, ups and downs throughout the entire process. But like we mentioned earlier, as long as we set forth that expectation and that education, I think that the athlete is a little bit more secure in that process, and they understand that, and so they don't become pessimistic in the process. They keep that optimism that we've tried to cultivate from the beginning throughout the entirety of the process from the rehabbing or reconditioning standpoint.
And that's the biggest thing. I think we, as clinicians, we see it as linear. It's on the page. These are the phases. It's gonna go in this order. And if we educate the athlete, like these are the phases that we're gonna be working on, they might think it's linear too. So to your point, it's just like, see, you set that expectation right up front. This is where we're headed, but it's gonna be an up and down. It's gonna be an up and down road to get there. Yeah.
We're going to have some speed bumps and some roadblocks and things like that, but we're going to know how to navigate through the noise because we have our principles in our back pocket.
Yeah, that's great. That's really, really great. Well, we could talk about these things for a while. I want to save a little bit for the webinar.
Again, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And
dive in a little deeper on there.
Yes. And again, that's coming up. It's September 8th. Jared, do I have that right? 8, 9? Okay.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And Jared, where can people learn more about you? Where can they connect with you? What are some of the things you got coming up?
Yeah, people can connect with me on Instagram. Dr. J Fit Boyd is my handle. I'm actually working on or attempting to work on a website right now, just to coming up with just blogs and thoughts and things that I have, like a little journal or a little book with a lot of just stuff that I dump in there, but I want to actually make it come to fruition and then start to write a little bit more online. And so I figured I'll go with a website. But then I'm also working on more of like a resource manual currently that has topics ranging from stress science, pain science, energy systems development, sprinting, all those different variables with blogs, key research articles that I think fit those particular topics, key people in that field, and I'm going to be sending that out to anybody that provides me with their email. So that should be done hopefully within the next 2 weeks. And then from there, hopefully one day I'll be able to start doing some continuing education courses, talking about how do we integrate physical preparation into the clinical setting and making things really look and appear and be a little bit more athletically driven for the athletic clientele that we're seeing, as opposed to miniband, Bosu ball kind of exercises. Things are a little bit more pragmatic in nature.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. We'll be on the lookout for that. It's out in the world now, so you gotta. That sounds like a big project.
But only 6 people.
Yeah, exactly. Only 6 people, so it's not that much pressure. But
yeah, it's pretty easy. It's not bad.
Okay. That's great, man. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. Really, really looking forward to the webinar. This was a really useful conversation. I think it is going to help a lot of people, and I definitely learned a lot. So we appreciate it.
I appreciate you guys.
We will, and other Jared, 1R Jared, thanks for being on.
Pleasure, Jared. Oh, happy to do it, man.
This was really throwing me off, having the 2 Jareds, because
I could tell. Yeah. I know. It was fun.
Yeah, that was great. I appreciate you guys.
Yeah, we'll talk soon.
All right, have a good one.
Peace.